Great, thank you, Tara. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Again, on behalf of the whole MCTAC team, I would like to welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Ashley Fuss, and I am the Director of Evaluation here at the McSilver Institute, and I'm joined by my colleague, Chris Copeland, who is a MCTAC consultant, and we are going to be taking us through today's session. So just before I get started, I just wanted to give a little context about what you can expect in today's webinar. So as you may have already seen, MCTAC has recently launched a new data series called Data Beyond the Tip of the Iceberg. And this series is a bunch of different modules that focus on different areas of data. And so far, the first 4 modules to the series, as well as 2 data tools, have been released and are available for download on our website. And each of these modules is about 15 to 20 minutes long. So what we're doing really today is just having this live webinar, which is going to be a summary session of where we're kind of combining all the different content and kind of summarizing some key information from these first 4 modules into this one live session. So I'll be going over the content, and then as Tara said, we'll also have a chance and opportunity for folks to ask any questions that they may have. So again, if you haven't checked out those modules, I do encourage you to go to our website and to review them, because it will, the modules do give a little bit more of a deep dive into some of these areas than we will have time for today. So I think before we get started, we're just going to kick off with a quick poll from our end to see if if you have viewed any of the data modules that I referred to on our website. That will just be some helpful context for us as we are going through today's session. So if you please just take 1 second and respond to the poll, that would be great. And Tara, we can close it out whenever you think is appropriate. Great, so it looks like some of you have seen the modules and a bunch of you have not, so it's great. So a lot of this content will be fresh. And again, then if you have not checked it out, I do encourage you to go to our website and listen to the modules in full if you would like some additional information about anything that we talk about today. So with that, I'm going to go over the agenda. So as I said, we already did our kind of welcome and introductions. We will talk about a little bit about what is data. We'll go over the data matrix, talk a little bit about self-assessment, go over the data gap assessment tool. We'll talk a little bit about the next modules in the series, and then we'll have time for some questions at the end. So when we were thinking about the series, we really liked this kind of iceberg analogy for kind of 2 main reasons. So for one, right, when we think about data or the data that we actually look at and collect, we kind of think about that as being like just the tip, right, or the very top part of the iceberg that we can kind of see. But if we actually, looked a little bit closer or thought a little bit more, there's actually way more underneath, right, that is to kind of be discovered and to be looked at, and all this other data that we probably have, but in reality, we probably aren't really using. And then second, when thinking about kind of this iceberg, a lot of times when we're looking about data, sometimes we may only be looking at the numbers or the top part, but not really digging deeper into what it actually means, right? And if you know anything about icebergs, right, we know there's so much more below the surface, and that's kind of how we're thinking about data. I think one thing that we know from kind of our work, and that you guys know as well, is right, is that we often organizations often, right, don't really lack data, right? Everyone has more data than they probably know what to do with or want to deal with. But what we actually don't do is that we don't often use this data effectively. So really, when we're thinking about kind of this session and kind of this whole series, kind of this gap between having data and using data is really going to be a main area that this series is going to focus on. So as I said before, this data series is really designed to help support organizations and help them use data more effectively as it relates to both business and clinical practices. The series also is going to give folks and agencies a set of customizable tools that you can use to assess your data use and be able to strategically plan how to strengthen some data-driven decisions that are being made at your organization. So as I said before, this is kind of a summary webinar that we're doing, but kind of the format of this whole series is that there are a set of short pre-recorded modules that are available on our website. And each of these modules kind of builds off of one another, but also can stand alone based on different areas of need or individual interest. So there's going to be 13, maybe 14 modules in this series. And these modules are being released about every 2 weeks or so. And then after we release about every 4, we're going to kind of have these live summary sessions where we'll go over kind of some key takeaways and then also have a chance for questions. So this is just a list of what these different modules kind of look like. And again, there's about 13 in here, and they're kind of bucketed into these different kind of categories. So like I said already, the first 4 have been made available, and the others are coming in the next few months. So now we're going to talk a little bit about what data is, or how kind of we're thinking or defining data throughout this series. We'll talk a little bit about some tips for reading data, and then go over some ways that organizations are currently using data. Right, so there's often this misconception or idea, right, that data is something that has to be and always is very complicated, very complex, and is hard to get. And while all those things absolutely can be true, we also use data a lot more than we probably think we do, right? Both in our personal lives and also in our professional lives to inform the decisions and the actions that we take. So, for example, here. Right, when thinking about professionally when we're working and when we are considering things about when is the best time to say send an email that needs a quick response, when is the best time to announce some kind of important event, when is the best time to have a meeting when we know important decisions have to be made, right? So from our kind of trends or patterns or things that we see from our colleagues and from our partners, we know when some of the best time for this stuff is, right? So maybe we've learned over the years that 4 p.m. on a Friday is probably not the best time to have a meeting where some big decisions have to be made, because at that point everyone is just burnt out, right, and ready for the weekend. The same thing with a kind of a personal life, if think about things such as like working out. So asking questions like, are my workouts making a difference? Am I building muscle? Am I able to run faster? Do I have more energy? All of these answers to these questions really are just data, right? And I wanted to kind of use these examples to kind of frame kind of today's discussion. Because I know a lot of times, in our work or like in my schooling and training, a lot of times when we talk about data, right, the reaction is kind of that it's scary, and or we hear things that, like data isn't for me, or I'm bad at math, or I don't do numbers. And while I totally hear you and understand, I also really want to challenge you and push you to really think and to not be afraid of data, and to kind of learn how to like embrace it, because it has really important implications for our work. So what is it? What am I talking about when I say data, right? So data is defined as raw, unorganized facts that needs to be processed. Whereas information is when data is organized, processed, structured, or presented in a given context as to make it useful, and it is called information. Right? So for data to become information, it really needs to be put into context for it to have any real meaning or value, right? So if I just tell you, the average is 24 hours and 24 is theoretically a data point without any context or additional information, that number really is not helpful at all, right? But if I tell you that, 24 hours is the amount of time it takes for follow-up after hospitalization, now 24 hours means something. And this context really gives it its value, right? So the data are the facts or details from which information is derived. So when we're thinking about reading data, these are just some key kind of points or key things to think about when we're maybe reading a report or reading an article having to do with data. So the first point really is related to standardization. And standardization is really important and kind of always comes up when we're talking about data. So when I say standardization, what I mean is really the process of making sure that your data elements are defined and measured in a similar and systematic way so that data can be compared, right? So I think a lot of times in our work, we use the examples of kind of no shows or no show rate. And it's really stepping back and saying, how are we defining no-shows, and how are we measuring this, right? Because if we want to say compare no-show rates across clinicians, it's really important and critical that the no-show is defined and measured the same way if we want to be able to compare across folks. The next piece is really have to do with what is the goal of the report or the data that you're looking at, right? So a lot of times, right, if you're shown like a chart or a table or a graph, and someone's like, "Hey, what do you what do you think of this? What does this mean?" Really taking a step back and asking the questions about, what is the goal? Where is this data coming from? What is it trying to say? Really gives important and critical context when looking at data to really understand, what it is trying to say. A chart is just a chart, but without knowing that information, there's really not much meaning kind of behind it. And related to standardization, the next piece is really the idea of operationalizing or defining your terms, right? So making sure we often throw around language that we assume, right, everybody else knows what we're talking about, or maybe we don't clearly define it. But when it comes to data and reporting, you really want to make sure that you define your terms so that everybody is kind of reading it the same way and everyone is taking away the same thing that you want them to. The next two are sample size and population size. And a lot of times in, say, a report, you'll notice that sample size is depicted with a lowercase n and population size is depicted with a capital N. And those are really two important things that you want to keep in mind when you're reading data, when you're reading a report, is kind of knowing what your sample size is relative to what your population size is, right? So if you have, say, 1,000 kids in a school and that's your big N or your population, and then you're reading a report that has, 50 kids, a report that is 50 kids versus, right, a report that has almost all of the kids in the school, those are kind of telling two different stories. And so knowing your sample size, especially as how it relates to your population, is just really important to look at and to remember when you're kind of reading reports. The other thing is your unit of analysis, right? So what are these data points that you're talking about, right? Are you looking at individuals? Are you looking at programs? Are you looking at organizations? So knowing your unit of analysis and what your data are being reported is really important as well. The same thing with time frame, right? So when you're looking at numbers or when you're looking at reports, knowing what is my time frame? Am I looking at numbers from the last month? Am I looking at it from the last 6 months, the last year? So really kind of being aware of what, where is this data coming from and what is the timing around it. Another thing to keep in mind is the difference between what's a number and what is a percent. So I know I've heard a lot recently when looking at, COVID related data or the research that's come out, there's been a lot of confusion about, is it 10, is it 10%, and kind of what are these numbers? Because there is a big difference, right, between like 10 people and 10%. So really just being mindful when looking at stuff and making sure it's clear about what it is that you're reading and how it fits in, or, is it a data point, is it a number, or is it a percent of something larger? Similarly, also when we're looking at, a data table, and there's lots of rows or lots of columns, and they're all add up to be a certain way, but also looking and seeing, which way do the rows and columns kind of add up to be 100? Is it vertical? Is it horizontal? And really just being mindful about how you're reading the data table. And then I think at the end, really just after you kind of did all this, taking a step back and asking yourself, right, if this finding is really meaningful or usable, right? Sometimes we see, things in data that we might think is important, but then if we dig a little deeper, we find that it's actually, right, just like a fluke, or it's actually not. So really asking yourself about, is this finding meaningful and what it's actually saying, right? So I know, that there are lots of different ways, right, that organizations or that we currently use data in our day-to-day work. Right, we can use data for organizational decision making. We can use it for regulations, for clinical decision making, for CQI. We can use data in supervision and to hold our staff accountable. It's very important in MCO negotiations, when we're developing our value propositions, if we're responding to RFPs, in fundraising, and also in recruitment efforts. So next, Chris is going to talk a little bit about our first tool, which is called the data matrix. And I'm going to pass it to Chris, and he's going to take us through it.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, Chris Copeland here. I'm a consultant with MCTAC, and more recently, I was the Chief Operating Officer at ICL. So We given all that use of data and data across an agency, what we wanted to do was provide a structured way of looking at data that would enable an agency to think about where data is required, what data you have, and strategically think about building data within the agency. So that's what we're referring to the matrix now, and I'll show you that in a couple of minutes. But basically, it takes a balanced scorecard approach. I think we all know that effective management of an agency really needs to balance a lot of what seemingly competing pressures: finance, quality, compliance, are all sometimes in competing way. And most often, financial data is the one that is the data source that most agencies have a good handle on, and it's often lies within the senior management of an agency, and because it's the data that's really readily available and on hand and hard data, it's often the only data that's made to use decisions in an agency for that reason. And while, to use that oft-used phrase, there's no mission without margin, the financial data doesn't tell the whole story. So a balanced scorecard approach attempts to bring other data to the table so that a decisions can be made taking into account not just financial, but the quality and the quantity of staff, the work that's been done, and the outcomes that are that either individual programs, clinicians, or an agency develop. So trying to bring a holistic view to data within an agency, so decisions can be made in a more balanced way. And crucially, any data that we have really needs to link through to the mission statement. And I'll show you how this matrix can help do that. So if you want to go to, thank you. So what we've done is looked at the agency in two ways, and I'll probably use these terms a couple of times throughout the presentation. Vertically within the agency, and that means that we're looking from executive leadership, department program management, supervision, and individual staff. And we're looking at these not as job titles, but as roles. And I think that's an important consideration to take into account when we're looking at data, that somebody who is a program manager may also be a supervisor, and their need for data to run the program is quite different from the need for the data they need to do supervision. So that's why we looked at these this vertical look through the agency in terms of job titles rather than job roles, functions rather than titles, sorry. And when we look at our data for individual staff, we're not just talking about individual productivity standards maybe, but we're also talking for all staff across the agency, that anybody who works in an agency needs to have data to manage their performance. And that includes a CEO, and it includes maintenance staff and everybody in between. So the next way that we would look at the agency is a horizontal cut across the agency. And by horizontal, what we're meaning is that there are different domains within an agency, right? And they're listed here: finance, the human resource capital staffing, compliance issues, quality and compliance, the people that you're providing services to, and the outcomes. And these are defined here. I mean, for financial information, I think is probably fairly obvious. Human resources is data related to understanding the recruitment and the quality of the agency staff. Compliance and quality is about not only compliance against agency standards, but against compliance against quality standards that may be set up within an agency. Population is data related not only to individual clients and how how the services you're providing is impacting them, but also understanding the whole population that you're serving, and how and data related to populations rather than individuals. And lastly, probably the least understood in our industry is outcomes. How do we know that the mission of the agency is being impactful upon individuals and the communities we serve? So those are the two. If you go to the next slide, oh, sorry, this slide. So one of the fundamental parts of data, and to keep in mind throughout this discussion, is these three rights I've described them as. It's about having the right data to the right person at the right time. And what I mean by that is sketched out here somewhat. Is that the right data means it's specific, it's understandable, it's actionable, and the right person's getting that data for the services or the activities they're responsible for. So really good, specific, understandable data about the agency to a program manager isn't useful, but specific, understandable, actionable data about their program is getting the right data to the right person. And then it needs to be regular, timely, and available. This data can't be something that happens 3 months after the data isn't looking at activities 3 months too late. This is about as close to the activity as possible. It comes in a regular time frame, and it's available. It isn't something that people have to go searching for. So those are the sort of three rights as I've described them to keep in mind. The right data coming to the right person at the right time. That's okay. Actually, move on. So this is what the matrix looks like. If you remember this horizontal view of the agency and the vertical view of the agency, and what we want to do is look at data that's included, that's available for your agency in each of these quadrants. And I think what you'll find is going to be interesting is the top left-hand corner, the financial and leadership and department program area, is the area that most agencies have the most concrete information about. The profit and loss statements, balance sheets, information about how individual programs are managing financially is probably available, and it's probably used on a very regular basis by any leadership or program leadership within an agency. But as you move towards the right of this matrix or down through the matrix, you'll find that I think that data becomes less and less available. Information about outcomes on an agency level is something that we're beginning to, as an industry, begin to scratch the surface on. And data that's available for individual staff to know how their performance is against certain metrics or benchmarks is often rarely available. So when we look at this matrix, I think beginning to fill this in, as I think as the next slide will show. So you can go forward one, and I'll go back again. Ashley, sorry. So this is sort of what our attempt to look at what a completed matrix would look like. And what it tries to do is identify in each of those sectors what information you should have and who should have it. So, using the financial sector of the agency, agency leadership is going to want to have profit and loss statements that are available on a regular basis that tell them how the agency is doing and how individual programs are doing. The individual department program manager isn't necessarily going to need that overall, but it's going to need profit and loss statements for their program that arrive on a timely basis, that have clearly defined targets against either census, either against contracts or against budget, or both, and arise in a way that they're able to understand it, that they've been trained how to use it, and are able to make decisions based on it. And then for a supervisor, they're going to need a subset of that data. So they're going to need a data that just tells them about their staff productivity, their staff performance. And again, that needs to arrive in a way that's very timely and actionable for them. So, and then as we move across towards the right-hand side of this matrix, we then begin to look at outcomes that tell the leadership of the agency and also stakeholders how well those programs manage to achieve the mission of the agency. And again, this is something that isn't as commonly developed as other data in terms of financial data. And again, that needs to roll down to, so if the agency sets a outcome for the agency against combating A1C levels, and it can see as an agency how it's doing and how it's improving the community. How is an individual program meeting those goals, and how does individual staff meet those goals, and the supervisor needs that information. So as we move further towards the right of this matrix, it becomes much more agency specific in terms of decisions made by the agency as to, in terms of quality compliance, for instance, what's the risk assessment that's taken place to decide where an agency is most at risk and needs to be doing audits against that risk. Those are going to be agency specific, and decisions need to be made at sort of a leadership level to understand how that risk is going to be managed throughout the agency. So I hope you can see that this matrix can be a way of looking at different parts of the agency in a strategic way to decide what data needs to be in whose hands in an actionable way. And if you go back to the slide before, actually, and that just recaps that really, is that you can look at this and use this as a strategic planning tool. The gap analysis tool we'll be talking about in a couple of minutes is a way of doing an internal review of the agency to look at each of these elements to see, do you have information that's available and actionable for people to use. So that's the matrix as a way of looking at in a sort of a coordinated way how data is used within the agency. And the last point about this, I think, is using this as a tool to connect what people do to the mission statement. So if it should be obvious from looking at this that an individual staff's performance leads to a performance of a program and also a performance, the performance of an agency, be that financial or be that outcome driven. So by completing this is a way of being able to connect individual data through program, through leadership, back to the mission statement. So therefore it can be a useful tool to connect individual staffs, the demands that we have on staff, through to the agency mission. So I'll pass it back to Ashley now to talk a bit about self-assessment. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So now we're going to talk a little bit about self-assessment and what it is. And I want to start with this cartoon. And I chose this cartoon to kind of start the discussion about self-assessment because really a part of self-assessment is really like taking a pause, right, to reflect and not being afraid or disappointed at kind of what we see and what we kind of learn about ourselves or our agency kind of through this process, right? So we're all really busy people and we're usually go, 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 go. And a lot of times taking a step back or a pause to kind of assess how we're doing doesn't really come naturally, right, to most of us. We have to kind of make this conscious effort or this conscious decision to kind of do so. And right, it's also sometimes easier not to self-assess, right? So not to think about these things, because if we don't know, we can kind of keep pushing things under the rug and not have to, use our energy or time to kind of work on these things. But I would always argue, right, that knowing is better than not knowing. And then in the long run, right, knowing what our strengths are and knowing our weaknesses really allows us to kind of grow and to be better. So as we talk today about self-assessment, I just want you to remember, right, that no one is perfect. And I think that there is always room for us to improve and be better, right, both personally and also in our work that we do at our organizations. So what is it that I mean when I say organizational self-assessment? So it's a general agreement among organizational development professionals that organizational self-assessments is a really valuable and helpful activity. So organizational self-assessment is the systematic process for obtaining information about organizational performance. And really self-assessment is the act of kind of monitoring and knowing what type of adjustments that we may need to make in order to enhance our performance. And assessments really provides us with an opportunity for individuals or for work groups to kind of take a step back, as I said before, from our daily, day-to-day activities and really reflect on our organization in terms of, right, what are our strengths and kind of what are the areas of opportunity. So why is self-assessment important. So conducting self-assessment really helps us answer, right, some key and important questions. So self-assessment allows us to answer things like, how are we doing? What are our strengths? And what are kind of some areas that we really, could work on or improve on? So this process is also really useful in creating a common language and providing us with an analytic framework that helps us, establish kind of what are some areas that we want to focus on or prioritize. It really just gives us the foundation when we're thinking about strategic planning and kind of creating organizational change within our environments. So, what makes a good self assessment? So, according to the research and the literature, right, there are kind of these five key areas that we know that make a good self assessment. And when we were kind of designing this one, these were kind of principles that were all part of the process or things that we kind of kept in mind when we were creating it. So, the first one is just conceptual domain. And all that means is that the assessment really should match the area of the organization that we're trying to measure or understand. So for this project, right, we're really focused on data and knowing kind of what our areas of strengths or areas of opportunity are. So this assessment really focuses strictly on data. The next piece is concreteness. And what I mean by that is just the less abstract the concepts or questions are, the better, right? So the less you have, room for a lot of interpretation, kind of just we know that we get better results when we have things more concrete. The next principle is really this idea of diagnostic guidance. And all that means is that the assessment should help us understand what our strengths and weaknesses are and provide us guidance for improvement. And that's something that we spent a lot of time thinking about when we developed kind of this assessment. And you'll notice in the actual assessment that depending on how you score in the different kind of areas, we offer kind of a recommendations or some sort of work plan or areas that you really could focus on to help guide improvement in those areas. The next one is affiliation. And all that means is that a strong affiliation kind of lends some legitimacy to doing an assessment. So whenever we're thinking about doing an assessment, it's important to really understand and to know who it is that's creating it, right, and where this kind of stuff and assessment type is coming from. And the last piece really is validity, which is the degree to which the assessment is considered acceptable and provides us with accurate results, right? If it's not going to give us accurate or good results, then there's no point in doing it. So really this validity piece is really important for us to keep in mind when we're thinking about assessments. So what do we know about self-assessments? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know from kind of the research and a little bit about what we know from kind of doing this work for the number of years that we have been doing it. So when it comes to the research, right, we know that the utility of self-assessment is really important, right? But self-assessment is only as good as kind of our ability to accurately and reliably kind of self-judge ourselves, right? So, and the one thing we do know is that the accuracy of self-assessments is often flawed and it's actually positively biased. And what I mean by it's positively biased is that when we're asked to kind of assess our own skills or our own performance, we're more likely to kind of overestimate our abilities and to kind of think that we might be stronger or kind of better than we actually may be. And then we also know that emotional intelligence is really another piece of our ability to kind of self-assess. And what I mean by emotional intelligence is really kind of just these areas of kind of how self-aware we are, how good we are at self-management, how socially aware we are, and how good we are at kind of managing relationships. So from the research, what we know is that emotionally intelligent people have the confidence of knowing what they're capable of and understanding what our strengths and weaknesses are. We also know that an experience with self-assessment really does impact our accuracy, and that accuracy is often improves the second time around. We also know that accuracy varies by gender, and that men are often more likely than women to rate themselves more highly. We also know that completion time also impacts accuracy. And some studies have shown that the longer we spend doing an assessment, and actually results in lower accuracy. So here at, MCTAC and McSilver over the years, we've conducted and developed a number of these, OSAs to help different provider and government organizations to kind of assess different areas of organizational readiness for system change or something else. And I think what we found over the years is that our own experience really does map on to the research literature about what we know, especially as it relates to the points about, the questions being concrete and less subjective. So you may remember if done any of our old OSAs back in the day, a lot of our questions had rating scales that were things like strongly agree, and all of that. Where now we really have shifted kind of that approach and really tried to make things more simple with kind of a yes, in progress, or a no, to kind of try to keep the questions and answers as concrete and less kind of subjective as possible, because we know the less subjective, the better. We've also, I talked a little bit before about the idea of kind of of being positively biased. And that's something that we've also seen, I think, in our work, right? So these are just some examples here of some questions that we've kind of asked over the years. And I think what you'll see here, right, is organizations tend to rate themselves really highly in a lot of these areas, right? So these are just 3 examples when folks were asked to rate themselves about their ability to collect data, about their ability to implement CQI projects, and the ability to kind of show their value impact through data. And you'll notice here with all of them that on average, the average score is usually about a 4 out of 5, which we know is pretty high. And I think what we found also is, when we actually then dig a little deeper and we talk to folks about these things, we often do find that these are actually areas that many organizations do struggle with, and that they could use support on. So I think that just, kind of just maps on and kind of shows how, what we've seen in kind of this real world is really also similar to what kind of the research literature also says. The 2 last points I just want to make is really this kind of idea of the team approach and kind of the idea of change over time. And really one of the reasons why we do recommend this team approach is kind of trying to, minimize some of these things that we know commonly kind of come up. That I kind of just talked about, right? So if you have a more diverse group of people, you're, maybe less likely to be biased towards your staff. You have different genders and all that kind of good stuff that really, in our experience has shown that this team approach is really kind of beneficial. And the same thing with change over time. What we know, right, about accuracy is that things we kind of tend to get more accurate the second time around we do this. And I think that's something we also have kind of, seen in our work. That folks often do get more comfortable and feel, more confident in doing this when they do it the second time around. So now I'm going to pass it back to Chris, and he's going to walk us through what this data gap assessment tool actually looks like, and where you can access it and how you can use it and all that good stuff.
Well, thank you again, Ashley. So yeah, so I mean, trying to look at your agency and figure out where you have data and how useful it is can be overwhelming. So what we try to do is create a tool that you can use to assess each of these domains across the agency. So the tool itself is split into these 6 domains, which map back to the matrix. There's an additional one. There's some questions about the overall agency, but the rest of the domains look at finance, human resources, quality compliance, population served, and outcomes, which is the horizontal view of the agency. And it's basically split into 60 questions, which are nearly all of them, all but one, are no, in progress, or partial, or yes. And I'll go into what those definitions mean. And when it's completed, at least the Excel version that we've put out creates a work plan for you in terms of where you should be looking for data. So if you want to go to the next slide. So with any assessment like this, we recommend that this is done as a team approach, because the data that we're looking at doesn't lie within one area, as you can see. So we're suggesting very much that the team that's used is members across finance, HR, IT, but also throughout the agency. So you have managers, supervisors, and staff taking part in this. So you get a really good view of not only what does leadership think about data, but also what do staff who are using it to make decisions on a day-to-day basis feel about the use of data within the agency. And it's not just about looking at this overall is not just necessarily just looking at the concrete use of data, but also the culture of data within an agency and how much of it's trusted and how much of it's used. I really recommend that this is done very formally, that you have an executive sponsor that underlies the commitment to the agency to look at data within and data use within the agency, that somebody's leading this, this review of data who has a designated authority to do that. Because if we're trying to draw together people from across different departments, then somebody has to have that designated authority. And I also recommend that you say to the staff and board that we're doing this. So there's a very open, transparent review of data within the agency, that you're committed to doing it, people know you're doing it, and you've developed a formal reporting mechanism back to staff and board. The last part of doing any analysis like this and doing assessment is that you need to think about how you're going to change the agency to meet some of the findings you have. And later on, module 13, I think, will be looking at how to do a CQI process to do that. Next slide. And so the tool is available within MCTAC's, on MCTAC's website in two ways. One is an Excel spreadsheet, which I'll show you as you complete it, generates an automatic work plan. The other is a PDF version that allows you to print it and hand it out and use it in that way. Next slide. So the questions are split into these 6 domains. There's questions relating to the overall commitment to and development of data within the agency. There's questions around the use of financial data. There's questions related to understanding the recruitment and quality of the agency staff that you have. There's questions related to quality and compliance, population, clients served by the agency, and also the use of outcomes. So that's how the questions are organized. And there's 3 ways of answering the questions. No, there's clearly no evidence that the statement within the assessment is true. No, in progress or partial means that either you've started or some of the agency is using data in this way, but you can't say it's true across the whole agency. And the only way you're really saying yes is it's really obvious that this statement's true consistently across the agency. So if we're looking at profit and loss statements, for instance, yes, they are all they're all developed, they're all provided to program directors, and they're used in a consistent way. So you could score yes around that. So that's the scoring we want to do. And this is roughly what and I'll go through each of the domains quickly now, but because the questions are fairly self-explanatory, but each of the questions starts at a broad level. And as the questions are asked through, I think each section has 10 or 11 questions, they become more specific and more individualized to staff. So in other words, although these questions are to do with the horizontal domains of the agency, they tend to work their way vertically down through the agency. So using the example of the profit and loss statements, is the agency preparing them on a monthly basis? Do they come out each month? Do the managers get them? And are the managers trained to be able to understand and use the data to make changes? The same is the same process for human resources. Do you know, are your salaries benchmarked against market? Do you know turnover within the agency? Do you know it by program, by position? Do the managers know that? Is there a regular satisfaction survey that's conducted of staff, and does that information go back to individual managers and staff so they can begin to make action, develop action plans data based on that feedback? Quality compliance. This is where the set of questions begin to be more designed to say, has the agency decided what compliance or what quality issues they want to measure? Because without those decisions, obviously the data becomes meaningless, or it's impossible to develop data if you're not asked the right questions. So the compliance questions, the population and the outcome questions are more based around saying, have you made a risk? So if you can just go back. So sorry, if you, Ashley, you can go back to the quality. Thank you. So the quality compliance starts off by saying, have you done a risk assessment and identified high needs areas that need to be audited? And then have you put in place an audit system to be able to audit against those high risk? And are those findings being given to the staff, the managers who need them to be able to make plans of corrective actions? The same for quality. Have you decided as an agency what it is that you want quality standards to be? And then we look at population served. We're not just looking at the client, the way that clients receive services and how they're affected, but we're also looking at the population that you're providing services to in general. And then the last area, probably the one that we will find the least available data or decisions around, is around outcomes. And it really starts off by asking the agency or individual programs, have you identified what the outcomes you're aiming at in terms of the services provided by the agency? And if you have you a way of collecting the data? Is that data then shared with individual staff so they can manage their programs to improve? So the tool itself then generates automatically a score against each of those domains. There's a nice graphic to be able to see whether you scored, how you scored, and the reds are if you scored no. The green is if you scored in progress or yes. And then finally, what it begins to do, if you go to the next slide, is then generate a list of recommendations. So anything that scored 0, it's suggested. So if the finance question was, do you prepare profit and loss statements on a monthly basis? The answer is no. Then the work plan would suggest that you do prepare them. And if we look at the next slide, this is an example of, say, the quality compliance questions, and 2, 4, 5 of those are answered no. So these 5 are suggestions as to what you should do to fill in that, to begin to fill in that work plan. And the last point about the matrix is very customizable. These are our recommendations as to the data that should be in each of those fields. But obviously, for each agency, that data set could be different. And as I said a number of times, if you move towards the right-hand side of the matrix, those become very, very agency specific and dependent on decisions made by the agency as to what they want the data to be. But every time that the data then should be available and actionable for people to use.
Thank you.
So
I do want to just make clear that so far, so we've talked right just now about the data matrix and the data gap assessment tool, and both of these tools are available for download on our website, right? So if you go to mctacny.org, if you search the way you normally search, or if you just type in iceberg in the keyword, then it's the first thing that pops up, and you were able to download all of this stuff. So the matrix is in a PDF, and the data gap assessment tool is available in 2 formats, as Chris said. So there's the Excel version where it kind of gives you these reports, right, and this kind of work plan. And then for folks that prefer to kind of do it on paper, so it's not as sophisticated, so it doesn't score it or give it, the graphs, but a PDF is also available that could be downloaded. It could be done on paper, and there's scoring instructions included. So both of those tools are available on our website for download.
So the last slide, really part of the presentation, is saying that the next 4 modules, we're going to look at each of those slices horizontally across the agency. So we're going to look at how leadership, what data do you need, and how do you use it? What data does the management need? Supervisors and staff. And not only have we got our presentations, but I think for the supervisors, and we've also got input from some data champions later on who are going to be able to talk about their use of data specifically within outcomes and the use of data to manage individual staff's productivity and quality outcomes. So we're hoping to be able to do this in more detail over the next 4 modules, and then have some real life examples of how this has been put in action. And then questions, I guess.
Yeah, so I do want to be mindful of time. I know we have about 8 minutes or so left on the clock, and I do want to leave time for if there's any questions or comments or things that you would like clarified. So Tara, I don't know if any questions have come in or if folks have questions, and if you want to, say it, you can raise your hand or whatever process Tara thinks is best.
Yeah, so we did receive one question so far, and we invite you to either chat in your question, or if you'd like to raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can ask your question aloud, whichever you feel most comfortable with. But we received one question during the self-assessment section, and it was on, can positive bias be attributed to culture?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I guess I'm unclear if it's the culture of the organization or individual culture. But I think both would probably be applicable. But I think it's kind of just our nature, right, of us as humans wanting to be good at things and seeing ourselves as good at things. So there definitely is, right, that pressure, whether it's internal pressure or pressure right from the outside world, that we are good at things. And I think that definitely impacts the way that we kind of answer questions or assess ourselves, is that we want to be seen in a certain kind of light or way. And I think culture, as well as lots of other things, really impact that. So thank you for that question, and I hope my response made sense.
Thanks, Ashley. So I haven't seen any other questions come into the chat.
Of course, we're available. There's the details there about how to send in questions afterwards via email, and we'll certainly get back to you within a day or less to answer any questions that you may have.
And also just to say out loud that these slides and the recording, I think, will also be available on our website after the fact. So maybe let's give a few more seconds of any questions or comments. And if not, on behalf of MCTAC, we would like to thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to speaking again with you all soon as we continue the series and go through our remaining, trying to do math in my head, 8 modules or so. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for listening and taking part. Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks, Chris.